I might have been able to turn that noise off.
Yeah, I think you may. I've heard it one more time, but I'm not sure the last person who's joined has made the noise. So.
Yeah, it's working.
It seems right. So that's better because I know again people sometimes join a bit late around 2:15 or something like that. So it's a bit annoying for you if you hear more noise. Very warm afternoon, very warm welcome, rather everyone. It's not so warm today. A warm welcome, everyone. We're waiting 5 more minutes before we start so that everybody can join. So a few more people are joining. 3, 4 more minutes before we start. Hello, Claudia. Hello, Karen. How are you? All right, Michelle, are you ready?
Anytime.
Anytime? So I think we're going to start. All right, so let's start. A very good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leila Shukran. I'm Professor of International Law and Director of the University of Portsmouth theme in democratic citizenship. Today, we have the pleasure and the privilege to welcome our colleague from Portsmouth University, Dr. Michel Lesseur, from the School of Mechanical and Design Engineering, who is going to address the question of materiality, a materiality principle to tackle sustainability challenges. As you know, indeed, a number of stakeholders, civil society organizations, international companies have embraced the principle of sustainability. However, we speak a lot as well, and we see a lot of greenwashing. Is it really genuine? What sort of element do we need to coach to materialize really this adhesion to sustainability? So these are a few of the questions Michelle is going to address today in what's going to be a really very interesting presentation. So Michelle, without further ado, the floor is yours. Can I just remind everyone, if you want to ask questions, please use the chat box. There is an icon at the bottom of the screen. It looks like a bubble. You can use this icon, this chat box, to ask your question to Michelle, and I will read out all the questions at the end of Michelle's presentation. The floor is yours, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in for this presentation. Before I start, I'll say this is that presentation is slightly adapted from a presentation I delivered last year at Sustainable Operations and Supply Chain Management Conference. My area, my PhD was in manufacturing management, and I teach supply chain management and operations management related subject in the School of Mechanical and Design Engineering. So a little bit, sorry, I have to restart the presentation. There we go. A little bit about the background. So I'm assuming today I have many people that are coming from a different discipline than mine, and in basically in all academic discipline, we've all sort of embraced that idea of researching sustainability, and whether or not we have been successful is a bit of a debate. And I've put a few references here that that I'm using to sort of frame how I'm approaching the problem. The first one from Pajal and Shevchenko is a classic in my field of study in supply chain management. Mark Pajal is actually the chief editor of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. And in 2014, he published a paper, and the title of his paper is that research on sustainable supply chain management has no future. That's quite a, sort of says it all. And he develops in his paper the reason why he think all the research we've done in my area have basically been fruitless. And one of the key concepts he has is every time we read something about a sustainable supply chain, we're talking about harm reduction. We've managed, for example, to reduce carbon emission by 5% in 1 year. And he's saying there's very little research that is concerned with complete harm elimination, as in a completely green system altogether, which would be the result of radical innovation. In a later paper, the same two developed a mathematical model to show currently in the current economic system, companies basically have a disincentive to seek radical innovation, to look for what they call true sustainability. And I'm going to be using that expression. It comes from Pajal and Shevchenko. So you've got sustainability, which obviously according to them is not sustainable. And then you have true sustainability, which is really sustainable. And they say that basically, if you're given as a business, if you're given a choice between radically innovating and thereby taking a risk, or for example, doing some offset, which is going to make you look good and is going to prove that you're engaging with sustainability, well, you'll choose the latter rather than the former. And I've also included two other references. Now, Gray and Choice are accountants, so completely different discipline. Gray is definitely worth a read. This is a very well-written paper. He describes sustainability reporting, so the claims that companies are making as fairy tales. I quote in the paper, things you tell yourself so that you could sleep at night. And one of the points that he makes in the paper that's quite interesting, he says you have to think about what is the nature of accounting, and especially in the more common English, the idea of providing an account. And he says, if you feel that you have to provide an account, typically it means that you feel guilty. And he's saying, so for him, sustainability report of a firm saying, I am sustainable because I've done this, is completely unconvincing, but they're representative of a feeling of guilt. The point made by Choi is slightly different. They describe sustainability reporting as an organizational facade, a window dressing of the company as a nice citizen that is concerned about the environment. So we've got, from the accounting field, we've got two notions that seems to intersect with sustainability. One is that notion of guilt. The other one is that notion of wanting to look good. Now, I did not come to this presentation and this research, from these papers. I've looked for the papers after I started the project, and the way I came into the project was as an individual consumer. Every time I have to make decisions, sometimes I'm a bit uneasy. If I have to buy a car, I could buy a green car, but I know it's going to be more expensive, maybe even not within my price bracket. But I have a certain lifestyle, which means that I need big cars, and then I have a conflict there. And these issues of guilt and these issues of, but I want to look good, sort of come into the equation. And this is how I started to ask myself, on the micro, at my level, the decision that I make, am I really going to make a difference? Am I really going to change something? And that's how I started to zoom on that notion of materiality. So bear in mind, talking back about that notion of true sustainability, basically my understanding of what Pajel and Shevchenko talk about when they talk about true sustainability, it means a substantive material impact on the environment, a good impact. And plain sustainability, for lack of a better word, or non-sustainable sustainability, would be something that I would call it's not material. You've not done enough to actually make a difference at the level of the natural environment. Now, materiality is a classic concept in accounting and in auditing. It basically states that if you find a discrepancy in the accounts, you could ignore that discrepancy provided that it does not change how an investor would read your report. So if it's likely to induce an investor into an investing mistake, no, you have to address the discrepancy. But if it's minor, then you could just make an adjusted entry and forget about it. And I'm not the first to talk about materiality in sustainability. The little diagram you can see on the right-hand side of the slide there is taken from the Global Reporting Initiative Sustainability Standard. It is actually on the first document if you download that standard. And you could see that they basically tell you, how do you decide if I include something in a sustainability report or not? And they tell you if it has a significant, and by significant, we're getting into the notion of material impact on economic, environmental, then you should report it. So if I'm on the right-hand side of the diagram, then definitely I should report it. What I thought was interesting, and bear in mind, this is one of the most famous sustainability standards, they said you also have to take into account what your stakeholders are thinking about it. So basically, if you have something over there where it has a substantial impact, but actually the stakeholders don't really think it's important, well, you don't have to report on it. And if you're there, which really, this is something that does not have a big impact, but people are really worried about it, then you better write about it. And I thought that was interesting, going back to my first slide with this notion of looking good, and why are we doing sustainability? Are we doing it because we're primarily concerned with the natural environment, or because we're trying to look good? So I definitely like the horizontal axis in that diagram, but I'm not completely convinced by the vertical axis. So my question is, if I want to come up with a materiality principle, how could I design it and how would it work? And I've put some example here where I've tried to put on the right-hand side what I would call big ideas, completely imagine UK electricity tomorrow is 100% green. There's not a single gram of carbon emissions associated with electricity. And when we were told to all switch off a standby device light, they don't consume a lot, but obviously when you multiply by the number of standby lights in the country, that actually is quite a lot of energy at the end of the year. And some of the example that I've put on the left-hand side as potentially not material may be controversial to some of you. And that's actually the point I'm trying to make. It's difficult when you start to talk about materiality. It's difficult to agree on where are we going to draw the line between what we're going to call the non-material and the material. So this slide is equivalent of my literature review. So based on what I've read in the sustainability literature, is why, if you're going to try to define a materiality principle, why it is going to be difficult. The first thing I've already touched upon this is because stakeholders do not necessarily pressure us to do the right thing. There could be some sustainability fashion or some perception of sustainability that means that all of a sudden we're really focusing, for example, on lights in buildings, but on the scale of things, is that really the most important issue that we're facing? The second issue is what I call sustainability waste. I'm showing my operations management color here with lean. So the idea is, when you come from a field like mine in general, we don't like to spend money on something that is going to have no impact. We like to measure that we're getting results. And the idea of spending money on a sustainability initiative that is actually not changing much and not really helping the natural environment, it would be what we call waste. There's a fair bit of literature on that. And if you want to read more about this, you have to read the papers that are written about carbon offset, because that's something that people who run carbon offsetting schemes are very interested in, because they don't want to be accused of greenwashing or things like this. So they have a number of principles to sort of check that the money they're going to invest from offsetting receipt is indeed going to have an impact. Now, there's another problem when we talk about sustainability, and I've called it here imaginary impact pathway. What I mean with this is a problem of unit of analysis. Does it make sense to say that one business is sustainable when the business in isolation is a small player compared with entire economies, for example? And you've got two viewpoints. The Winroth paper here is one that says you can define sustainability at all levels. Imagine like a hierarchical thing where you could go from factory to department, back to business, back to supply chain. And Pajal and Shevchenko generally saying that any attempt to define sustainability at the micro level is going to be unsuccessful, because at the end of the day, sustainability is a planetary concern. It's a planet altogether. And the last challenge, if you're trying to define materiality, is to make sure that we all agree on what sustainability means, because if we don't share a definition, well, we're certainly not going to share a definition of what is material or not. And for that, I'm using a framework from Levy. I'm going to try to move that because that might obscure the diagram. Now, Levy, that's a paper from ecology, so they know much more about ecology than I do. And they basically said that when we look about how can we work with nature, there are different perceptions that are based on, are we taking a human-centered view or a biological view? And do we believe that nature is in a single equilibrium or is capable of multiple equilibrium? So in that first one, the exploit nature, this is a bit of a Donald Trump sort of view of nature. Basically, nature is indestructible, it's in a stable equilibrium, we can do whatever we want. The opposite view at the bottom, in preserved nature, is a view you can quite often read about in the newspaper, and it's the idea behind is that nature is very fragile and it is in a very unstable equilibrium. It would not take much, deviation to generate an ecological catastrophe. Now, if you prefer the view where there are multiple equilibriums that are possible, you've got that view there, and that view corresponds typically to the United Nations framework on sustainability. And basically it means we're at an equilibrium here, and we can work, we can have economies and so on. But if we go too far, maybe we're going to flip to a completely different state of nature, something where some species will have disappeared and other species will thrive. And the bands in this diagram says that all of these equilibrium would be acceptable to us, but there's a risk that we might push nature into something which is human unfriendly, and that is undesirable. But the idea is we're trying to engineer nature, to push nature in a way which is compatible with what we need. And the paper by Levy is discussing this view here. which is not the idea is that nature is very fragile, not the idea that it's constant or disbalanced, but it's resilient. And there are natural processes at play that make nature more resilient. And what they're saying is we have to adapt because nature is permanently changing, becoming more resilient. In their paper, Levy are concerned about the fact that if we focus too much on what they call sustainability, we could be stopping this process whereby nature is becoming more robust. And if we stop this process, we're effectively making it more fragile. So and we shouldn't interfere with the natural process through which ecosystems are becoming more resilient. So that shows you an extent of the possible debates that you can have about a definition of sustainability. So what I'm trying to do is to come up with my materiality principle, bearing in mind that, if I were to do a quiz right now, we would probably sit in different area about how we view nature. So onto my framework to define materiality. So I've taken a framework that was initially published by Karamazov and his colleagues in international finance about modeling the contagion of currency crisis. And the problem they were concerned with, how can you explain that currency crisis can happen in two countries which are not in geographical proximity of each other? And they came up with a model where they say that the biggest explanatory variable is the fact that they have a common creditor, a bank that they both share. The bank is hurt by country number one. It enters in lending restrictions, which has an impact on country number two. And I thought, you know what, that might just work for understanding what's going on, because in this case, it is definitely a common creditor. It's actually the only one, the natural environment. We all borrow from it on a daily basis in various ways. And we typically don't think about repaying this loan. It's a very benevolent banker. We can just use natural resources and worry about it later. So what I'm proposing to do, and bear in mind the framework is based on that paper by Karamazov, is first to do an audit. So it could be at the firm level, at the supply chain level, at the country level. So you could adapt that. So if I talk of a business, for example, so I could be talking about what are the resources that I need to operate my business, and I do a Pareto analysis in terms of how much I rely on this resource to run my business. If the bars are in gray, it means it's a scarce natural resource. So I'm exhausting the natural environment. And the total of these bars give me the 75% here, which shows me that for this firm, I am actually quite dependent on natural resource borrowing to do business. You could think of service firms where we might actually be at 0%. We don't need natural resource to run anything. But in that case, that would be fairly high. Now, the second variable in the model, excuse me, the second variable in the model is out of all the borrowers, what is my share of borrowing? So in this case, I'm saying out of all the people that borrow similar natural resources, I'm actually borrowing 25%. So I'm a big borrower. And that gives me a point in that scale. So in the model, the risk of a crisis, a collapse of the system, is computed. The probability of a crisis is computed by multiplying the horizontal axis by the vertical axis, and then that position you in this part there. So that's a zone of crisis. And so in my case, I'm using the same framework to conceptually define the fact that there's probably a line of threshold here, and over here, yes, we could be creating a serious environmental crisis. I have a line of materiality. So below that, I'm saying, as a business, we're not hurting the environment. There are bigger fish out there that we should worry about it. And the middle zone, I call that the zone of concern. One concern is that your business is overly dependent on natural resources. Or over here, it's not dependent, but it's overly exploiting because it's borrowing too much of it. You almost have a monopoly of the borrowing of that natural resource. In that slide, I'm showing that I can handle all the definitions. I'm not really looking seriously at the exploit nature. As I said, that's a little bit of a Donald Trump sort of approach to sustainability. The preserved nature, if that is true, then my model does not work because my principle of materiality collapse. If indeed nature is fragile to the point that a very small, like a butterfly effect sort of thing, could create an ecosystem crisis, then my line of materiality is either shifting down like this or is not there, and then I will admit I'm wrong. But if you look at the multiple equilibrium sort of understanding of sustainability, if you look at the sustainability one there, basically what this means is that there's a risk that we could flip to a new sort of natural equilibrium. That's why I've put a second diagram at the back. It would be new conditions, new rules, new things, new definition of sustainability. And if you believe in the adapt to nature view, well, basically it means that these curves can move. If nature is indeed becoming more resilient, it means that my threshold curves are moving this way. It could be that maybe we're going through a phase where nature is becoming more fragile, in which case my thresholds are moving this way. And you could also imagine that the width, of my zone of concern is increasing or decreasing. Okay, so so to illustrate this, I have 3 case studies that I'd like to quickly go through. So the first case study, I looked at a UK trucking company. I selected it because it has won the Green Award of the UK Freight Forwarding Company for several years. So I downloaded their annual report, all of the everything that they published on why they think they're sustainable, and I applied my Pareto diagram about what are the natural resources that they're using. And when I was reading, all I could read about in his annual report was about the fact that they were awarded the prize because they had this brand new state-of-the-art green warehouse where they had managed to significantly reduce carbon emissions, energy consumptions, and etc. And that's the number 2 source. Now that's estimated as per my computations, and that's the number 2 source of borrowing of a natural resource. But when you do the math, if they didn't have a green warehouse, I mean, that graph would be just about there. It's not a massive change in there. What I was surprised about is when you read all of these reports, nobody's talking about the elephant in the room, which is what is that on the left there, and that's the CO2 emissions from their fleet of diesel trucks. And it's enormous, and it represents for a single firm 0.3% of UK carbon emissions altogether, and 1% of the sector. So basically, if I apply this to my diagram, it means it's positioning it here in the really high, very dependent on the natural resource to run the business in the first place. You cut the supply of oil, the business is out of business automatically. But so low that you could say, are they overly dependent or are they in the non-material zone? And what that case study showed me is that if you are in that corner of the framework, basically what you need to do is you need to, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. You need to look up. So look up, it means that if you are landing there as a business, you need to look at your sector or at your supply chain. You need to really ask yourself, what am I doing to the natural environment? And sure enough, if you look at the transportation sector in the UK, it represents 27% of all carbon emissions, which is, that's definitely material. There's no question there. So there's a real sustainability problem with this company, and a real challenge. Now, the second case, I thought it was based on a conference paper, and the original version was done with a colleague of mine, David Bennett from Chalmers University. So he did the case, and it was a Green Campus Initiative. And the Green Campus Initiative, interestingly, defined the major metric as emissions per student, and came up to the conclusion that what they needed to do was to reduce the teaching space and, in general, reduce the footprint of the campus to increase a key performance metric, which was emissions per students. It's all to do with building and pretty much nothing else. And what was interesting is there was actually no publication of actual emissions figures, just these ratios with a set of targets over 5 years. They actually missed all of the targets. But in the discussion with my course, it was quite interesting. We were saying it sounds like we're decreasing teaching quality in a way. and for what? Because if that firm is 0.3% of carbon emission, you can imagine what a single campus would be like. I'm going to need a microscope to be able to position case B somewhere down there, because we're not talking of very, very large scales emissions. Now, my last case is the surfboard manufacturing. Now, why surfboard manufacturing? It's an interesting sector where actually the product, the surfboard, is not very environmentally friendly, but the users really like the environment because they spent all of their time in the sea. Most of the raw materials are from the oil supply chain, basically. The processes to make the polyester foam and so on, they're very high energy consuming type of processes, and even the shaping of the board itself is not very good for the environment in terms of emissions and things like that. It's an industry that has been fascinating in its effort to design the green surfboard. This is an example of one. It's about 2 or 3 times the cost of a normal surfboard. I mean, the innovation is spectacular. They're using recycled PVC bottle for the pad on top. They're using flax instead of carbon. And if you start to read about design of surfboards, honestly, the innovation is fantastic. And I certainly don't want to give the impression I'm criticizing it, because there's certainly something to learn from the amount of innovation these guys have done. It's a sector that's interesting, where there's a lot of guilt. Surfers like the environment, but they like waves, so they drive a lot, and they take a lot of planes to go to Indonesia, Australia, and etc. So they have a guilty conscience. For some reason as well, quite ironically, people who like surfing likes to drive a Volkswagen Transporter with diesel engine, which is somewhat ironical if you're concerned about the environment, and that's the car you have to drive. But what was interesting in that case study was to see that the global emissions, I'm not talking of UK manufacturers, I'm talking of all manufacturing of surfboard on the planet, is 0.1% of UK emissions in total. And the global, all manufacturers together are basically emitting 83% of my trucking company per year. That's an entire industry altogether that has spent millions into designing a green product, and we're still below the emissions of one single UK trucking company on the scale of things. So onto my conclusion. What I've learned by doing this, this project, is that basically, if you look at natural resources, there are very strong Pareto effects. The impact we as individuals, firms, or supply chain have the environment are incredibly variable per sector. And for that reason, I would say it's a bit controversial to try to solve sustainability by completely ignoring the existence of this Pareto effect. We really should put the emphasis on one, what in Pareto analysis we call the critical few. Because the critical few, if we manage to transform one of these critical few into a green solution, there would be an immediate massive reduction, in environmental harm. What was also interesting in this was this notion of guilt and this notion of wanting to look good, which until I did the case studies and I looked at the paper, I'd never really realized that maybe that's what is driving us more at the moment. And the fact that potentially all of us have been driven more by guilt or by wanting to look good is really ironical in my discipline, in operations management. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about the Toyota production system, total quality management, just in time. When you look at how these frameworks were designed, the Pareto analysis is the starting point. They're all framework from the 70s and the 80s, but when you look at how they've done it, they were incredibly organized and astute in the thinking about how they were going to tackle the problem and to solve it. And at least speaking in my field, and I'm talking of sustainable operations management, it seems like we've forgotten that in a way. So that was my presentation, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was really very interesting, absolutely fascinating. It touches upon a very vast number of questions and is extremely interdisciplinary. I'd like to ask you the first question. We have received quite a bit of questions from the audience, which is always a very good sign. The first question from me, having worked, myself on responsible finance, works on business and human rights with different UN special representatives. Don't you think we should talk about, rather than guilt, greed really, and look not only at stakeholders, but rather the shareholders? So have you tested your hypothesis with the finance people, the shareholders of companies, and how exactly would you like to approach that from purely financial perspective, knowing that generally, the reporting is made for the shareholders?
Yeah. Yeah. I know certainly in my field, there's been a number of papers, and the reference for Shevchenko in 2016 in particular, they do document the fact, maybe not solely from the perspective of the shareholders, the more general stakeholders perspective. They do say that there is a problem in that the stakeholders are not putting the right amount of pressure. Yeah, they're not either motivated, or maybe there's a greed issue underlying in there. But it's very difficult if you want to achieve what you would call sustainable consumption, sustainable production. It's very difficult to try to become a sustainable producer if you don't have sustainable consumption. Unfortunately, a lot of business is based on that decoupling idea. You've got marketing on the one side that deals with the customer, and then you've got people like me in operations that deals with the factory, and then you've got other people that are dealing with the investors. We like to specialize like this, and maybe at one time in history, for the sake of efficiency, to increase profit margin and so on, that decoupling was functional. Okay, it was maybe a good idea. But I think in the area of sustainability, that idea that we decouple everything is starting to have a bit of a kickback on how we can manage. We can't decouple sustainable consumption from sustainable production, and we can't decouple it from sustainable investment either. It's
Absolutely. That's a very, very important point, I feel. And again, extremely interdisciplinary. I don't know to what extent you know that, but in international, we talk about fragmentation of international. It's just the same. And this fragmentation is actually intentional. So it comes from management. The problem is that we now realize that if we want to tackle really important issues from human rights to sustainability, it's impossible to decouple, to fragment. So we have a number of really interesting questions. I'm going to try to capture everything. The first one from Owi. I wonder if our relationship with the car will change due to the COVID, and as we have looked at the rusting asset on our driveway. So what general question? So what do you think about cars? Also, he adding up virgin plastic producers buying and investing in plastic recyclers is an encouraging step towards increasing sustainability. So I suppose that general question on the impact of the pandemic on all you've discussed.
Yeah, the pandemics were certainly interested in. We've realized, we can survive without doing too much driving, and we're okay. The car is an interesting case because bear in mind, for most of us, with the house, it's one of the biggest purchases we do. And when you think of the purchase of the car, there are actually some really strong trade-off between cost, function / utility, and then environmental impact. And I think one of the problem in the car industries is most of the progress that have been done recently, either if you want to talk about the European initiative of designing green diesel, which we now know is a complete fiasco, and the Japanese gave up diesel as for passenger car back in 2000. They said we're out altogether, but we pushed on, and and then comes the Volkswagen scandal on top of that, to sort of add the cherry on top. The problem is the design push, the R&D push. I'm not convinced has been in the right direction. Everything that has been done in terms of making greener vehicles has been at the cost of function and utility for some users. So and it's interesting in the context of the pandemic is that the use range of the car, if I can define it like this, is becoming narrower and narrower. And if they continue in this way, then I think there's a possibility that we'll reach the conclusion, well, this is a really expensive asset that doesn't do much for me. So maybe I need to think differently. But I think if you think of a design tree with all the different decisions that you have, there are other technology. Hydrogen is definitely one that's promising that could be scaled up to the level of the fuel cells cars. That could be. I know they exist in California, but my understanding, and especially in the UK, we're shying away from investing in that direction. They also solve other bigger sustainability problems, such as balancing intermittent energy production from renewable energy, and to me, they appear to me as a really exciting avenue for research, but it's slow going in this way. Can you repeat what was the second part about the plastic?
Well, I think that was just an illustration, actually,
Okay. Yeah.
by this person. We have a second question from Danielle. Surely we need. Oh, right. I've just lost the question. So sorry. Surely we need. Give me a second, because Daniel has been quite prolific. There are a number of questions, actually. Right. Surely we need a big idea, and what could this be?
Yeah, I like the idea of that question, which is, which goes back to my idea of doing Pareto diagrams. Well, let's look in the UK, or let's look in the car industry, or in the aerospace industry. Let's look at what is the big issue, the one where the Pareto principle is that typically 20% of the source of environmental pollution will generate 80% of the impact. So let's tackle these 20%. They're extremely challenging, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's easy, but at the moment, we're sort of avoiding the main problem.
Daniel was mentioning developing a life cycle C2C thinking approach for all products, activities, and services based on the ISO Environmental Product Declaration, EPD standard. This should incorporate natural capital, accounting, etc. Some thought on all that, but you might have responded already.
And no, the idea of using life cycle analysis is another classic case where your analysis of what is sustainable or not is if you've thought enough, you could build a bridge, but that bridge after 2 years, or 5 years, you have to rebuild it because you didn't use the right grade of material or something like this. The framework that I'm proposing, bear in mind, it's a conceptual framework. I don't have the biological knowledge to tell you the science behind these curves, and to give you numbers, but you could customize it to plot the trajectory of a firm, for example. So you could introduce a time dimension in there, and something that could be compatible either with life cycle analysis, or the evolution of products, or the evolution of firms over time.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. We have another interesting question really from Karen. Materiality is used in accounting by auditors when planning and performing the audit in order to evaluate the effects of misstatements in the financial statements. It is not used by the accountants who are drawing up the accounts or financial statement to determine what to include. Everything should be included. So taking your example, why would we attempt to leave things out? If we all switch off lights, the total of the energy saving would add up.
Yeah, so there are two good points in there. The first one about materiality. The first time in my life that I heard about materiality was when I took an accounting class, and I was taught, the materiality principle, which is pretty much present in every single accounting system that's used today. Interestingly, in my personal experience, I have very rarely seen accountants, and as Karen pointed out, accountants in the workplace actually invoke the principle of materiality. it's quite unusual that someone says, "Oh, we're not going to bother about this," you know. And I've actually seen sometimes quite the opposite, you know, spending hours because there was a, you know, 20p missing somewhere, and because somebody didn't do the right entries, and spending really a lot of time trying to sort this out when, you know, the principle of materiality is there. So I'm using it because that's the best word to describe what I'm trying to say. But I'm aware that in accounting, the way it's used is a bit different than what I'm talking about. As for the second point, you're really going back there to the Pareto analysis and the principle of Pareto. Now, when you draw a Pareto analysis, you're looking for that shape you could see there, which is, you know, like it looks like an hyperbole. It's and so the causes that are there on this side, they're the one we call the critical few, and in a real life a Pareto diagram, you would have a long list of small problems there that don't add up much in terms of importance, and we call them the you know, the trivial many. And the idea of Pareto is to say always work, and as a manager always focus on the critical few. Don't waste your time and effort on the trivial many. So to answer the question, if you look at an industry sector where you have a strong Pareto effect like the one I'm showing there, then it makes sense, you know, using a principle of materiality or using the principle of Pareto means the same thing. It means solve that problem here. If you imagine a different firm, and imagine you have an almost flat curve, all of the problem are about of similar importance, then yes, Karen's points stand completely. You could tackle, well, you have to tackle all of them. And it's worth saying that in quality management, when you start looking at trying to solve quality problem with a Pareto analysis, when you start doing the Pareto analysis, typically you've got very strong Pareto effect. After 3 or 4 years of working on quality, the strong Pareto effect disappears, so that you know, very steep curve there starts to become a shallow curve, almost flat, and it means you have a system of much better quality. Okay, and I hope that one day, yes, we'll be able to do a presentation and we'll be talking about carbon emissions or other environmental issues, and these Pareto diagram will be flat, and then you could basically spend time on improving any. I don't think we're there yet.
Thank you so much, Michelle. In relation to that, we have a question from Tom. The concept of materiality is effectively a greenwashing test. Perhaps a second metric, such as proportionality, should be introduced to weight the purported sustainability advances.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a bit more than greenwashing. Greenwashing definitely would be captured by materiality. There's also that notion of resilience. You know, if you think that nature is reasonably resilient, it means that the low end, the trivial many in the Pareto diagram are not going to challenge, you know, environmental stability. So if what you do is something that nature can absorb, can process, then you shouldn't worry too much about it. If what you do is like this, and it's pretty clear that the amount of CO2 that are, you know, generated every year by trucks around, which don't get me wrong, is a bloodline of the economy, but that's, you know, that's material, you know, and you can't. You're not going to solve the problem, you know, by focusing on the wrong end of the Pareto diagram. So there's that notion of resilience as well within materiality.
That's interesting. We have another question from Catherine. Let me find a question because it's changing in my list. Right. So sorry again. So, Catherine, life cycle and C2C are fundamental to any sustainable process and the definition of materiality, but it's always perceived as too costly, thus not always seen as an option.
It's true, and you've got techniques, you know, like you know, life cycle assessment analysis, LCA, and you know, if you've ever attempted one, it does get a bit tedious. Interestingly, there's almost been an application of the principle of materiality with these techniques, because you have LCA analysis, but you have something which is called light LCA, which sort of builds on this idea that actually, if I'm going to look at a coffee maker that I'm going to take apart, that I'm going to do an environmental assessment, well, I know very well which part are controversial. It's probably the packaging and the electricity consumption, about the life of the product, and anything else is going to be. So, but this is something, this is something that I find a little bit mysterious. We tend to want to deal with sustainability in an incredibly exhaustive fashion. When we do the LC analysis of the coffee maker, we really want to capture every single nook and crannies, of what is generating an environmental impact, when actually we can probably guess the answer fairly quickly. These Pareto diagrams that I'm talking about that were developed by Wilfredo Pareto initially, but that are a staple of quality management. They can be done very quickly, even with estimated figure.
I understand. We had another question from Catherine. That was the previous one, actually, about behavioral change. What do you think about it? She was saying, well, it takes a lot of time and people have generally habits which are very much entrenched. It takes time to change. So do you see any change in terms of behaviors of people?
Yeah, and it's interesting, you were talking about greed. I was talking about guilt and about pressure. And so I'm tempted to answer that question by saying that actually, given the amount of guilt and the amount of wanting to look good that we have around this theme, I would think that that is one case where the behavioral change would not be that challenging, with one exception, which potentially is the customer side, because at the end of the day, the decision to spend, do I buy expensive green electricity or cheap dirty electricity? Well, we all like cheap electricity, and this is where there could be an issue. But I would think that there's enough critical mass that is interested in sustainability that if we can really channel our effort on a big challenge, the behavioral change might not be such a constraint. But this is a very tentative answer. If anybody wants to prove me wrong, I will probably believe that.
Thanks, Michel. In relation to what you said before about cars and the diesel in particular, so we have a question from Amitava, who asks, why green diesel initiative is a complete fiasco? I believe production of green hydrogen and bio CO2 to make green diesel or green methane will make a significant positive impact. I work on hydrogen production from water and utilization using fuel cells, including CO2 capture, hopefully to make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, I was describing green diesel as something that went wrong, and so maybe I didn't make myself really clear. So green diesel was a big initiative of only European car manufacturers. I was an unfortunate customer who ended up buying one of these green diesel and regretted it bitterly. There was a famous Ford Citroën engine that basically could not be driven. This is a car. This was one of the rare car in modern time where they had warranty claims for turbo and engine failure during warranty. During the 3-year manufacturer warranty, and I think these cars don't exist. I think that's it, they're gone. But if you'd ever own one of them, you can't listen the word green diesel and start scratching. It was painful for the wallet if you were the unlucky purchaser. One of the things that I was saying, I'm concerned that especially the green diesel is restricted. These were cars that were designed for a very specific type of use, which is somebody who commutes at least 50 to 100 miles per day, and if you drive less than that, these engines were going to die. So these are not the cars that we used to have in the past, which could pretty much do anything. I am concerned about the push for electrical cars, which I view as well as cars that have quite a narrow range of use, so are not going to be interesting for a lot of customers. And all of the issues that exist with the electrical cars are solved with fuel cell cars. And what I'm concerned about, And I'm not enough of an expert to take a position, you know, in terms of the environmental impact of each and so on. But what I'm concerned about is a lack of willingness to. At the moment, I could see a great desire to explore the strategy of the electrical cars, not a very great desire to explore the strategy of the fuel cell cars.
I understand. That might be the last question from Catherine. That's interesting to see that it's triggering a discussion amongst the audience, actually. So it seems to be really interested in chatting. And that's the reason sometimes I can't see the questions because they're moving. A question from Catherine. She was saying, you know, I have cheap, dirty electricity because I choose to put money for my children's shoes or because I have other priority. So basically, to that, I'd like to add up something myself. Is it really an individual choice, or rather is it also a state, you know, public policy choice? Because if we do not receive subsidization, for instance, to change, well, nothing's going to happen.
And this is one thing I discovered, bear in mind, when I did the case studies for the first time. I didn't really know where I was stepping in. But basically, at an individual level, at a firm level, you know, these sorts of percentage, 0.3% of emissions in a country, that's the sort of thing. So can you imagine at an individual levels, you know, my share of borrowing is probably 0.00001, and I can then happily conclude that it is not material. And this is why I brought up that idea, you know, what I call the lookup. You know, we need to do the analysis more at the system level, and as you said, more at the state level. And by the way, you know, the evidence shows that at the state level there are strong Pareto effects. You know, there are countries that have massive CO2 emissions and others that have much lower CO2 emissions and other environmental issues. It's that idea that you can look up, and here you could look down. So what we need is almost a way of communicating ideas to say, well, yeah, you know, your purchase of electricity may not sound like much, but actually, you know, having looked at it at a higher level, we can tell you need to pay more attention, and maybe it needs to be into what you suggest. You know, it's
Indeed, we have a remark from Daniel who says industry will change on the basis of changes of consumer and also regulation. Because, you know,
I do have another paper that I'm currently writing, and in that paper I'm basically saying that I'm looking at it from another theory in operations management, which is the theory of constraints. So basically, the theory of constraints tells you that if you manage a factory, you should find what is the bottleneck, what is stopping you from increasing productivity. And it's silly to spend money away from the bottleneck because the bottleneck is still there and you can't produce more and you can't make more money. And in that paper, I'm concluding that very often the constraint to becoming more sustainable is not in the industry, but is on the consumer side or the stakeholders or the regulator.
Naturally. And how would you prove, is it possible to prove to businesses that they will indeed make more money if they become sustainable?
That's a slightly different question, because that one always gets complicated by the fact that with any new technology, you do expect learning curves. You know, the cost of a brand new green technology you develop is always going to be more expensive. The real question is your ability.
We've lost you, I'm afraid, Michelle, but you're coming back. I don't know if Michelle is hearing us. Well, everyone, it seems we've lost Michelle. Let's see if he's coming back. If he's not, I'd like to thank everyone for participating to this really very interesting. Oh, Michelle, you're back. All right.
All right.
We lost you
the whole time.
I wonder whether there was some sort of censorship. So we lost you in the middle of one of your sentences, actually.
What was I talking about?
Talking about this idea to sort of demonstrate to businesses, to show to businesses that there is a financial gain in
sustainable. And I was talking about learning curves, that is very difficult with a new technology to estimate what will be the cost when you have benefited from all the learning effects, and what will be the true cost of that technology. And it's a challenge, you know. It's
All right. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. Thanks very much to everyone for this really very interesting new webinar. I'd like to thank the team supporting the organization of this webinar series, Andy, Olga, and her in particular, as well as Marika. I'll see you next week for another really interesting session, completely different, on more literary sort of journeys with one of our colleagues from the University of Portsmouth. Thank you so much, Michelle, again for this fascinating discussion, and see you very soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Everyone. I think you have. If you can see the question, that's maybe interesting.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm actually going to take a quick look. I'm curious now.
That was interesting because there were a question and a chat going on at the same time, so I was sometimes losing.
Let's see. Yeah.
Question itself. All right. So thank you so much, Michelle, again. And
no problem. My pleasure. Anytime.
exactly. And obviously we'll be in touch. Thanks very much, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah. I'm just taking a bit of time to read all the comments.
Excellent.
Say
Thank you very much
for me.
Will do.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.